The doorbell's harsh ring shattered our peaceful Sunday afternoon like a bullet through glass. I opened the door to find two men in crisp navy uniforms, their badges gleaming in the autumn sunlight. HOA enforcement, the taller one announced, his voice carrying an authority that made my stomach clench. We need to speak with Veronica Pearson immediately. My mind raced. Our homeowners association had never had uniformed officers before, just a volunteer board and occasional newsletters about lawn height regulations. Something felt terribly wrong. Before I could question them further, Veronica appeared behind me, flour dusting her apron from the apple pie she'd been baking for Mrs. Clark next door. The men's expressions hardened as they spotted her. "Ma'am, you're in violation of multiple HOA bylaws, including unauthorized surveillance equipment. You'll need to come with us now." I watched in horror as they grabbed my wife's wrists, snapping zip ties around them with practiced efficiency. Their eyes swept our home like predators, lingering too long on family photos and locked drawers. As they dragged Veronica toward an unmarked SUV, her eyes locked with mine, not panicked as I expected, but calculating, determined. A look I'd never seen before. "Call Margaret." She mouthed silently, just before they shoved her into the back seat. The name meant nothing to me, but in the next 30 minutes, it would change everything I thought I knew about my wife of 15 years and our quiet life in Maple Hills. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Maple Hills had always been the picture-perfect American suburb, with its tree-lined streets and immaculate front lawns that seemed plucked from a 1950s television show. My wife Veronica and I had moved here 8 years ago, drawn by the good schools and safe streets, even if the HOA rules were stricter than we'd have preferred. I worked as a high school history teacher, coaching the debate team on weekends. Nothing remarkable about my life at all. We had a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters, a golden retriever named Bailey, and plans to start a family once my student loans were finally paid off. Nothing about our life suggested drama or intrigue of any kind. Veronica, with her honey blonde hair and quiet efficiency, had built a reputation as a respected technology consultant for financial firms in Denver. She drove into the city 3 days a week, worked from home the other 2, and volunteered at the community garden on Saturdays. Her clients valued her meticulous attention to detail and remarkable ability to solve complex security issues. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that her consulting business served as perfect cover for her actual work with the FBI's Organized Crime Division, where she specialized in financial tracking of criminal enterprises. For 8 years, she'd maintained this dual identity with such seamless precision that even I, sleeping beside her every night, never suspected a thing. Our neighborhood had its cast of characters, as all suburbs do. Mrs. Clark lived directly to our right, a widow in her 70s who'd been in Maple Hills since it was built. She baked cookies for new residents and kept track of neighborhood comings and goings from her front porch with surprising accuracy. Across the street lived 18-year-old Toby Mackenzie and his parents. The boy was a computer prodigy who'd already been accepted to MIT, always tinkering with drones and live-streaming neighborhood events on his popular social media channels. The Richardsons, the Alvarezes, the Patels, all normal families leading normal lives under the watchful eye of our increasingly demanding homeowners association, led by the perpetually dissatisfied Franklin Whitaker, whose recent election had brought a wave of new regulations and rising tensions among residents who felt the rules had gone too far. The strange occurrences began about 3 weeks before that fateful Sunday afternoon. I first noticed the unfamiliar van, dark blue with tinted windows and no company logo, parked at different spots throughout Maple Hills. It would appear for hours at a time, sometimes overnight, then vanish for days before reappearing elsewhere in the neighborhood. When I pointed it out to Veronica, she studied it with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to mere curiosity, but said only that I should note the license plate if I saw it again. I did, but it had none. Just a temporary tag in the window that was impossible to read from a distance. Then came the power outages, short, inexplicable blackouts that affected only certain streets in Maple Hills. The power company blamed aging infrastructure, promising repairs that never seemed to materialize. During one of these outages, Mrs. Barr Clark reported seeing flashlights moving through the community garden where Veronica volunteered, but by the time anyone investigated, whoever had been there was gone, leaving only trampled vegetables and a single work glove behind. Most troubling were the new HOA regulations issued by Franklin Whitaker's board. First came restrictions on security cameras, limiting their placement to doorways only, no coverage of yards or streets allowed. Then followed rules about landscaping that seemed designed to eliminate any dense foliage where outdoor security equipment might be concealed. When several residents, including myself, questioned these changes at the monthly meeting, Whitaker dismissed our concerns with bureaucratic doublespeak about community aesthetic standards and unified visual presentation. The tension in the room was palpable as neighbors who'd lived harmoniously for years began taking sides. "They're trying to monitor what we can monitor," Toby Mackenzie had whispered to me after that meeting. The teenager's conspiracy theory seemed far-fetched then. Now I wish I'd listened more carefully. The morning of the arrest, Veronica had been unusually distracted. She checked her phone repeatedly during breakfast, her coffee growing cold beside her untouched toast. When I asked if everything was all right, she smiled too quickly and mentioned a difficult client deadline. It wasn't until later that I realized she'd been tracking suspicious activity reports from neighbors in the community forum. Reports about 2 men claiming to inspect homes for HOA violations. By mid-afternoon, Veronica was baking in the kitchen, an activity she only indulged in when particularly stressed. When the doorbell rang, the men who introduced themselves as Officer Bradley and Officer Kimball wore remarkably convincing uniforms, down to the custom patches bearing the Maple Hills logo and the words HOA Enforcement Division embroidered beneath. Their badges, displayed in leather wallets, looked official to my untrained eye. "We've received multiple complaints about unauthorized surveillance equipment on your property, Mr. Pearson," Bradley announced, his voice carrying just enough authority to sound legitimate. He was tall, with close-cropped hair and the build of a former athlete gone slightly soft. Kimball, shorter but more solidly built, remained slightly behind, his hand resting near his hip where I could see what appeared to be a holstered weapon. "There must be some mistake," I replied, confused but not yet alarmed. "Our security camera is registered with the HOA. We submitted the paperwork when we installed it last year." Bradley's expression hardened. "We're not talking about your doorbell camera, sir. We've detected sophisticated monitoring equipment directed at community areas. That's a serious violation of new bylaw 23-7. Neighbors had begun to gather on porches and sidewalks, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. I recognized the curious faces of the Alvarez family next door, and further down the street, Toby Mackenzie had his phone held up, undoubtedly recording the entire exchange. When Veronica appeared beside me, wiping flour from her hands, something shifted in the men's demeanor. Their focus locked onto her with predatory intensity. "Veronica Pearson?" Kimball asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "What seems to be the problem?" "Ma'am, we need you to accompany us to the HOA office immediately for questioning regarding unauthorized surveillance equipment and accessing restricted HOA databases without permission." "That's ridiculous," I interjected. "My wife doesn't have access to any HOA databases." But Veronica put a calming hand on my arm. Her expression was puzzlingly serene. "It's probably just a misunderstanding, honey. I'll go clear it up." Before I could respond, Bradley moved forward, producing plastic zip ties from his pocket. "For security purposes, ma'am. HOA regulation." That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. No homeowners association would authorize restraints. "Now wait just a minute," I began, but Kimball stepped between us, his hand now resting openly on his weapon. "Sir, interfering with HOA enforcement is grounds for immediate sanctions against your property," he warned, his voice low enough that the gathering neighbors couldn't hear. As they secured the zip ties around Veronica's wrists, she caught my eye with a meaningful look. "Call Margaret Hall," she whispered. "Use my laptop. The password is Bailey's birthday, plus Maple 2016. The specificity of her instructions momentarily stunned me. In 8 years of marriage, I'd never once used her work computer, It was always password protected, a professional boundary I'd respected without question. They marched her toward an SUV parked at the curb, black with darkened windows and a magnetically attached placard reading Maple Hills HOA enforcement. Mrs. Clark, watching from her porch, was already on her phone, her aged fingers trembling as she dialed. Several neighbors approached, asking what was happening, but I barely heard their questions. "This is kidnapping," I shouted, following them to the vehicle. "You have no legal authority to detain anyone." Bradley turned to the gathered crowd. "Community members, please return to your homes. This is official HOA business regarding serious violations that affect neighborhood security." As they forced Veronica into the back seat, I made a desperate lunge for the door, only to be roughly pushed back by Kimball. "Sir, restrain yourself, or you'll face charges too." The SUV's engine roared to life. Through the window I could see Veronica's face, not frightened as I expected, but focused, her eyes darting around as if memorizing every detail. As the vehicle began to pull away from the curb, I ran back to the house, my mind fixed on only one thing: finding Margaret Hall, whoever she was, and getting my wife back before these imposters disappeared with her forever. I burst back into our house, my hands shaking as I fumbled with Veronica's laptop. Bailey's birthday was March 12th, so I typed 03215 Maple 2016 and held my breath. The screen unlocked, revealing dozens of open tabs, not consulting work as I'd expected, but case files, surveillance reports, and email exchanges with the FBI's Denver field office. My mind reeled as 8 years of carefully constructed normality crumbled around me. My wife, my Veronica, who fretted over garden pests and collected vintage teacups, was an FBI agent specializing in financial crimes and organized crime networks. A new email notification popped up from M. Hall with the subject line, "Emergency Response Initiated." I clicked it and found only coordinates and the message, "Tracking device activated. Team en route, ETA 12 minutes, delay them." 12 minutes. I needed to stall the fake officers until real help arrived. I ran back outside to find our quiet street transformed. Mrs. Clark had rallied her senior citizens walking group, 8 elderly residents who had spread the word up and down Maple Avenue with remarkable efficiency. They now formed a loose barricade around the SUV, which had only made it to the end of our block before being surrounded. "They've got no right to take her," Mrs. Clark shouted, her usually soft voice carrying surprising authority as she leaned on her walker. Mabel called the real HOA office. Nobody there knows anything about enforcement officers. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 neighbors, their expressions ranging from concerned to openly hostile. The Alvarez family stood with arms linked across the street. Mr. Patel from the corner house had parked his car at an angle behind the SUV, effectively blocking its exit from the cul-de-sac. Bradley and Kimball remained in their vehicle, engine running, clearly reassessing their options as the crowd thickened. Toby Mackenzie pushed through the gathering, his phone held high. "I'm live streaming this to the neighborhood group and 3 other platforms," he announced loudly enough for the men in the SUV to hear. "Over 200 people are watching right now, including someone who says they're calling the Denver police." I caught Toby's eye and mouthed, "Thank you," as I moved toward the SUV. Bradley rolled down his window just enough to speak. "This is interfering with official HOA business. You're all in violation of—" "Drop the act," I interrupted, finding courage in the support around me. "We know you're not from any HOA. The real police are on their way, and I suggest you release my wife immediately." Kimball leaned over from the passenger seat, his face tightening with anger. "You're making a big mistake. We have authorization to—" "To what?" came a strong voice from the back of the crowd. People parted to reveal Franklin Whitaker himself, the actual HOA president, his golf shirt and pressed khakis, a stark contrast to the imposters' uniforms. "I'm the president of the Maple Hills Homeowners Association, and we have no enforcement division, no officers, and certainly no authority to detain residents." A murmur ran through the crowd. Even those who disliked Whitaker's heavy-handed leadership seemed relieved to see him take our side. Bradley and Kimball exchanged glances, their confidence visibly wavering. I checked my watch. 8 minutes had passed since I'd read Margaret's email. We needed just a little more time. "Open the door and release my wife," I demanded, stepping closer to the SUV. or I swear I'll break the window myself." Bradley's hand moved to his hip, toward what I now realized might be an actual weapon. The crowd tensed, several people pulling out phones to record what was happening. Mrs. Clark stepped forward, positioning herself directly in front of the vehicle, despite her age and frailty. "You'll have to run me down, young man," she declared, her chin lifted in defiance. "And there are witnesses everywhere." Inside the SUV, I could see Veronica in the back seat, her hands still bound, but her expression focused as she worked at something in her lap. Our eyes met briefly through the glass, and she gave a slight nod that somehow conveyed both reassurance and warning. Just as Bradley reached for the gear shift, presumably to attempt pushing slowly through the crowd, the distinctive sound of sirens cut through the tension. Not just one, but several vehicles approaching rapidly from the main road. The crowd's attention shifted, people pointing and murmuring as 3 unmarked black sedans with flashing lights sped into view, followed by 2 Denver police cruisers. The sedans screeched to a halt, surrounding the SUV with practiced precision. From the lead vehicle emerged a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair cut in a severe bob. She wore a charcoal pantsuit and moved with the unmistakable authority of someone used to taking command. Behind her, 6 agents in FBI windbreakers fanned out, hands near their holstered weapons but not drawn. "FBI. Everyone stay where you are," the woman announced, her voice cutting through the confused murmurs of the crowd. She approached the SUV directly, badge extended. "Bradley Wilson and James Kimball, shut off the engine and exit the vehicle with your hands visible." The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the fake HOA officers complied, their earlier confidence evaporated. As they stepped out with hands raised, 2 agents quickly secured them in handcuffs, while others moved to the SUV to retrieve Veronica. The silver-haired woman turned to the crowd. "I'm Special Agent Margaret Hall, FBI Denver Field Office. Thank you for your assistance in delaying these suspects. We've been tracking this operation for some time." Her eyes found mine. "Mr. Pearson, your wife is safe." Margaret guided me toward the sedan where Veronica now sat, an agent carefully removing the zip ties from her wrists. When she saw me, my wife's professional composure finally cracked. She pulled me into a fierce embrace, whispering, "I'm so sorry you had to find out this way." Over her shoulder, I watched Bradley and Kimball being placed in separate police vehicles. Their expressions had transformed from authoritative to defeated, both men casting nervous glances around as if expecting someone else to appear. "Who are they really?" I asked Margaret, who stood nearby supervising the scene. "Small-time criminals recruited by a much larger organization," she replied. "They've been running this fake HOA officer scheme in several Denver suburbs, gathering intelligence on residents, installing surveillance equipment, and extorting money through fake fines." Veronica, composed once more, added, "I've been tracking their financial operations for months. We knew they were targeting Maple Hills next, but we didn't anticipate they'd identify me as FBI or make such a bold move in broad daylight." As the initial chaos settled, the neighbors gathered around us, their expressions a mixture of confusion, concern, and undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Clark pushed to the front, still clutching her walker. "So you're not really a technology consultant?" she asked Veronica, sounding more impressed than betrayed. Veronica smiled apologetically. "That part's not entirely untrue. My specialty is cybersecurity and financial tracking. I just do it for the FBI rather than private companies." A ripple of excited whispers spread through the crowd. Toby, still live streaming, whispered loudly, "This is better than any movie." Margaret addressed the gathering again, her tone authoritative. "We appreciate your community's assistance today, but this remains an active investigation. We'll need statements from witnesses, and we ask that you limit what you share on social media for now." As I looked around at our neighbors, some nodding in agreement, others already huddled in speculative conversation, I realized that nothing in Maple Hills would ever be quite the same. The revelation of Veronica's true identity had shattered our carefully maintained normalcy, and the community now stood divided between those who viewed her as a hero and those who felt deceived by years of secrecy. Franklin Whitaker pushed forward, his expression complicated. "I think we deserve to know what's really going on here," he demanded, looking between Veronica and Margaret. "If our community has been targeted, We have a right to understand why. You'll be fully briefed, Mr. Whitaker, Margaret assured him, though her tone suggested limits to what would be shared. But first, we need to secure the scene and check the suspect's vehicle for evidence. As if on cue, an agent approached Margaret with a small electronic device in a clear evidence bag. Found this under the back seat, ma'am. Looks like a transmitter. Someone was tracking their movements. Margaret's expression darkened. They were being monitored, she said quietly to Veronica. Someone wanted to know if they succeeded in bringing you in. The implications hung in the air between them, and suddenly I understood that the danger hadn't passed with the arrest of Bradley and Kimball. It had only begun to reveal itself. As the FBI established a perimeter and began a thorough search of the fake HOA vehicle, neighbors slowly dispersed to their homes, phones clutched in hands, eager to share the day's extraordinary events. Veronica stood beside me, her fingers intertwined with mine, watching the investigation unfold with professional interest. But when she turned to me, I saw in her eyes not the FBI agent, but my wife, worried, apologetic, and silently asking if our marriage could survive the weight of 8 years of secrets finally exposed to the light. The days following the dramatic arrest unfolded with a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Maple Hills. Our once cohesive community fractured along unexpected fault lines. As neighbors processed the revelation that Veronica, the woman who organized the annual garden tour and brought homemade scones to HOA meetings, was actually an FBI agent who had been investigating criminal activity in our midst. The neighborhood social media pages, normally filled with lost pet announcements and recommendations for reliable plumbers, transformed overnight into forums of heated debate about privacy, security, and trust. I feel safer knowing we have an FBI agent living among us, declared Mrs. Clark at an emergency community meeting hastily organized in the clubhouse 3 days after the incident. She stood with surprising vigor for a woman of her years, her voice unwavering as she addressed the packed room. Veronica has always looked out for this community. Remember when she helped set up secure payment systems for our HOA dues after that phishing attempt last year? Now we know why she was so good at it. But not everyone shared Mrs. Clark's positive perspective. Barbara Zimmerman, who lived 4 doors down from us, rose from her seat with lips pressed into a thin line. I understand why people feel reassured, but I can't help wondering what else we don't know. Has she been monitoring our internet activity, our conversations, our children? I'm not comfortable with surveillance, even if it's supposedly for our protection. The room erupted into overlapping arguments. Franklin Whitaker attempted to maintain order by pounding his gavel, but the divisions ran too deep for simple parliamentary procedure to contain. On one side stood those who prioritized security, already organizing a neighborhood watch program and discussing enhanced security measures. On the opposite side gathered those concerned about privacy rights, whispering about government overreach and domestic spying. Standing uncomfortably in the middle were families like the Patels and Alvarezes, torn between appreciation for Veronica's role in catching dangerous criminals and discomfort with the years of deception. I sat silently through most of the meeting, overwhelmed by the community's reaction while still processing my own complicated feelings. The man I'd been 3 days earlier, a history teacher with a normal life and a clear understanding of his marriage, no longer existed. In his place sat someone adrift, re-examining 8 years of memories through a new lens, wondering what had been real and what had been carefully constructed fiction. After the meeting dissolved into arguing factions, Toby Mackenzie approached me in the parking lot, his expression unusually serious for a teenager. Mr. Pearson, I thought you should know that some people are posting stuff online about your wife. Nothing too bad yet, but there's a private group forming called Monitoring the Monitors that's getting pretty paranoid. He showed me his phone, revealing posts questioning whether our house contained surveillance equipment pointed at neighbors' homes, whether Veronica had access to everyone's personal data, whether other federal agents might be living secretly among us. Thanks, Toby, I said, feeling a fresh wave of exhaustion. I appreciate you looking out for us. He shrugged, the gesture both casual and profound. Mrs. Pearson helped me set up security for my college applications last year. She didn't have to do that. Whatever her job is, she's still good people. Meanwhile, across town at the Denver field office, Veronica and Margaret were delving deeper into the investigation. Though Veronica called each evening, her voice tired but determined, she hadn't been home since the arrest. The separation added another layer of strain to an already overwhelming situation. During our brief conversations, she shared what she could about the investigation's progress, though I understood many details remained classified. "Bradley's starting to talk," she told me on the fourth night. "They were hired through a series of cutouts, paid in cryptocurrency. They never met their employer directly, but they received detailed instructions about which neighborhoods to target and what information to gather." "Why Maple Hills?" I asked. "Why us?" A pause stretched between us. "It's not coincidental," she finally admitted. "We believe certain neighborhoods were chosen because of who lives there. Government employees, law enforcement, people with access to sensitive systems or information. Like you," I said, the realization settling heavily. "They were targeting you specifically." "We think so," she confirmed. "Which means someone knows my real identity. That's concerning." The word concerning, delivered in her measured professional tone, sent a chill through me. If federal agents considered the situation concerning, the reality was likely far more dangerous than she was admitting. As the investigation deepened, Bradley and Kimball's initial interrogations revealed connections that stunned the investigators. Text messages recovered from their phones contained communications with someone identified only as coordinator, who had provided them with surprisingly detailed information about Maple Hills residents, including material that appeared to come directly from the HOA's private records. The financial trail led to offshore accounts and shell companies that suggested the involvement of sophisticated operators far beyond the capabilities of the two arrested men. By the sixth day, a breakthrough came when analysts traced suspicious login activity to an IP address registered to none other than Franklin Whitaker, our HOA president. When agents arrived at his tastefully decorated Tudor home to execute a search warrant, they discovered encrypted communications equipment and financial records indicating payments received from the same shell companies that had hired Bradley and Kimball. The news of Whitaker's arrest sent fresh shockwaves through Maple Hills. The man who had been so vocal about community standards, who had pushed for stricter rules and more comprehensive HOA oversight, had apparently been selling residents' private information and facilitating a criminal operation right under our noses. Some neighbors who had sided with the privacy advocates felt vindicated, while others who had trusted Whitaker's leadership were left reeling from the betrayal. For me, the revelation brought both clarity and deeper questions. The pieces were falling into place. Whitaker's insistence on new surveillance restrictions, the mysterious van, the power outages that had occurred during HOA database backups, but the full picture remained elusive. If Whitaker was involved, who else might be? How deep did this conspiracy reach into our community? On the seventh night, Veronica finally came home. I heard her car in the driveway well after midnight and met her at the door, unsure what to expect. The woman who stepped into our foyer looked simultaneously familiar and strange. My wife of 8 years, yet somehow transformed by the dropping of her long-maintained cover. She wore the same jeans and burgundy sweater she might have worn any other day, but carried herself differently, with a hyper-awareness I now recognized as professional vigilance. We stood looking at each other for a long moment before I opened my arms. She stepped into my embrace with a sigh that seemed to release years of tension, resting her head against my shoulder. "I don't know where to begin," she whispered. "How about with who you really are?" I suggested gently, leading her to the couch, where Bailey immediately jumped up to lay his head in her lap. For the next 3 hours, as night gave way to early morning, Veronica filled in the gaps of her hidden life. She had joined the FBI directly out of college, showing an aptitude for financial analysis and cybersecurity that quickly moved her into specialized units. Her assignment to Denver came 8 years ago, shortly before she met me, as part of an operation tracking money laundering operations connected to real estate developments along the Front Range. "Our relationship wasn't planned," she assured me, her eyes holding mine with an intensity that convinced me she was telling the truth. Meeting you, falling in love, that was the one real thing in the middle of all this pretense. I wanted to tell you so many times, but disclosure could have compromised years of work and put you in danger. And now? I asked. What happens now that your cover is blown? She ran her hands through her hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times, but now recognized as one of the few genuine habits she'd allowed herself. That's complicated. The operation is bigger than we initially thought. Whitaker's involvement opens up new angles that need to be pursued. Margaret wants me to transfer temporarily to the tactical team working on the broader case. Leaving Maple Hills, I said, not a question, but a statement. For a while, she acknowledged. There's a network behind this, James. They targeted me specifically, which means they know who I am and what I've been investigating. It's not safe for me to stay here right now, and it might not be safe for you either. The implication hung in the air between us. My life, too, would need to change as a result of these revelations. The school where I taught, my students, our home, everything was potentially compromised. We've arranged protection for you if you want to stay, she continued, but Margaret suggested that you might consider visiting your brother in Chicago until we've contained the immediate threat. The suggestion felt like exile, yet I understood the reasoning behind it. Still, something in me rebelled against the idea of abandoning our home, our community, when it was in such turmoil. I'm not leaving, I said firmly. This is our home, Veronica. These are our neighbors. I'm not going to disappear and let rumors and fear take over. She studied my face, seeming to weigh my determination against her professional assessment of the risks. Finally, she nodded. Then we take precautions. And you need to be prepared for the fact that things might get worse before they get better. Her warning proved prophetic. The following morning, Mrs. Clark called to tell me her car had been vandalized overnight. All 4 tires slashed and a crude message scratched into the paint, FBI sympathizer. The police documented the damage, but with no security cameras covering that section of the street, thanks to Whitaker's restrictive policies, identifying the perpetrator seemed unlikely. What was clear, however, was that the community's division had moved beyond heated social media debates into something darker and more dangerous. When I reported the incident to Veronica over the phone, her response was immediate and firm. Don't go out alone, especially after dark. Keep doors and windows locked. Report any unusual activity directly to Margaret's team, not just local police. You think this is connected to the investigation? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. It could be simple neighborhood tensions, she replied, her tone carefully measured. But the timing and targeting of one of our most vocal supporters suggests it might be an attempt to intimidate potential witnesses, or simply to sow more discord in the community. That afternoon, I received an anonymous email containing personal information about me. My teaching schedule, my student loan details, even medical records from a minor surgery I'd had 2 years earlier. The message was simple: control your wife, or next time we share this publicly. When I forwarded it to Veronica, her response was immediate. She called from a secure line, her voice tight with controlled anger. James, this changes things. We're sending a protective detail to the house tonight. Don't argue, she added, correctly anticipating my objection. This isn't just about intimidation anymore. It's a direct threat. As agents arrived to establish surveillance around our home, neighbors watched from behind curtains and blinds. Some, like Mrs. Clark and the Alvarez family, made a point of bringing over casseroles and cookies. Small gestures of solidarity in the face of growing tension. Others crossed to the opposite side of the street when walking past our house, their discomfort or disapproval evident in averted gazes. The investigation continued to expand, with Franklin Whitaker now cooperating with authorities in exchange for consideration in his eventual sentencing. His information led to the identification of 3 other HOA presidents in neighboring communities who had been recruited into the same scheme, selling residents private information, facilitating unauthorized access to home security systems, and identifying potential targets for various forms of exploitation. It's a sophisticated operation, Veronica explained during one of her brief visits home. They look for communities with high concentrations of government employees, military personnel, or people with access to sensitive systems. Then they infiltrate the HOA leadership, either by recruiting existing members or getting their own people elected. But to what end? I asked, still struggling to understand the bigger picture. What's the ultimate goal? She hesitated, weighing how much to share. It appears to be multifaceted. Financial fraud is one component. They've stolen millions through identity theft and real estate scams. But there's also evidence suggesting they're gathering intelligence that could be valuable to foreign entities or corporate competitors. The personal cost of the investigation became increasingly apparent as days stretched into weeks. Veronica would return home exhausted for brief overnight stays before disappearing again for days at a time. I continued teaching, but the atmosphere at school had changed as rumors spread about my wife's true occupation. Some colleagues kept their distance, while others asked intrusive questions I couldn't answer. Students, with their uncanny radar for personal drama, whispered when I entered the classroom. At home, the protective detail maintained a discreet but constant presence, a daily reminder that we were living under threat. Bailey adapted to the new routine of strangers in and around our house, but I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds and checking the security system compulsively before bed each night. The community of Maple Hills, meanwhile, continued its uneasy division, with neighbor suspicious of neighbor and the HOA in disarray following Whitaker's arrest. An interim board had been established, but participation in community events dwindled as residents retreated into private anxiety or resentment. The garden where Veronica had once volunteered lay untended. The community pool closed early for the season due to maintenance issues. And the annual fall festival was canceled for the first time in the neighborhood's history. As I moved through these altered landscapes of home, work, and community, I found myself wondering whether things could ever return to normal, and then questioning whether our previous normal had ever been real at all, or merely an illusion behind which darker currents had always flowed, unseen until now. On the 8th day after Veronica's dramatic arrest and rescue, Margaret Hall arrived at our home unannounced, just after sunset. The federal agents who had been maintaining a protective presence around our property immediately recognized her vehicle and allowed her through without question. I opened the front door before she could ring the bell, having seen her approach through the security camera feed that now played constantly on my phone, a precaution that had become second nature in the past week. "James," she greeted me with a professional nod. "We need to talk. May I come in?" Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she carried a secure laptop case clutched tightly against her charcoal pantsuit. Something in her expression, a controlled urgency, sent a wave of apprehension through me. "Is Veronica all right?" I asked immediately, stepping aside to let her enter. Margaret's composed features softened slightly. "She's fine. In fact, she's the reason I'm here." In our living room, with the curtains drawn and doors locked, Margaret set up her laptop on our coffee table. Bailey settled at her feet, having quickly accepted her as part of our strange new normal. "We've located what we believe is the central operation for the network that's been targeting communities like Maple Hills," she explained, typing in multiple passwords to unlock her system. "Based on intelligence gathered from Whitaker and digital forensics from the devices we seized, we've identified a facility outside Omaha, Nebraska that appears to be their data processing center." "Nebraska?" I echoed, trying to make sense of the connection. Margaret nodded. "It's strategic, centrally located, excellent internet infrastructure thanks to some tech industry development, but remote enough to avoid scrutiny. They're operating out of what appears to be an abandoned storage facility that was retrofitted with state-of-the-art security and digital equipment." "And Veronica?" "She's currently helping coordinate the operation to raid this facility," Margaret said, turning the laptop to face me. "I'm here because she insisted you deserve to know what's happening, and because you might be able to help us identify someone." The screen displayed a blueprint of what looked like a large warehouse complex, with various sections highlighted in different colors. A smaller window showed a live feed of what appeared to be a tactical operations center. Multiple agents gathered around computers and communication equipment. Though the audio was muted, I could see Veronica among them, gesturing at a large display as she briefed a team dressed in tactical gear. "This raid happens tonight," Margaret continued, her voice steady but intense. "Veronica's financial tracking and data analysis have been crucial in identifying this location and understanding its significance. The team is preparing to move within the hour." I stared at the screen, at my wife commanding the attention of seasoned federal agents, and felt a complex mixture of pride, fear, and disbelief. This version of Veronica, confident, authoritative, directing what was clearly a high-stakes operation, was both familiar and utterly foreign. I could recognize her gestures, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, but the context transformed these familiar movements into something almost unrecognizable. "Why show me this?" I asked, tearing my eyes away from the screen. "Isn't this all classified?" Margaret studied me carefully before responding. "Ordinarily, yes, but this situation has several unusual aspects, one of which directly concerns you in Maple Hills." She tapped a key, and the screen changed to display a series of photographs. "We've identified most of the key players in this network, but this individual remains enigmatic." She pointed to a blurry image of a man in a business suit, his face partially obscured as he entered a building. "Intelligence suggests he's the actual mastermind, the one who recruited Whitaker and organized the entire operation. We believe he's currently at the Nebraska facility, but we've been unable to confirm his identity." I leaned closer, something about the figure's posture naggingly familiar. "We think he may have connections to Maple Hills," Margaret continued. "Possibly someone who's been in position longer than Whitaker, someone who helped recruit him." A cold realization began forming in my mind. "Can you enhance the image at all?" Margaret nodded, typing commands that brought up several processed versions of the photo, each slightly clearer than the last. In the final enhancement, though the face remained partially obscured, the distinctive silver tie pin shaped like a maple leaf was unmistakable. "Robert Chambers," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He was HOA president before Whitaker. Stepped down 2 years ago for health reasons, but still attends every meeting. He's the one who nominated Whitaker for the position." Margaret's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "Tell me everything you know about him." For the next 20 minutes, I recalled every detail I could about Robert Chambers. His background in commercial real estate, his meticulous attention to HOA regulations, his campaign to install neighborhood security cameras that would feed to a central monitoring station for community safety. Details that had seemed benign at the time now took on sinister implications. "He's been positioning pieces on the board for years," Margaret concluded, "already typing notes into a secure messaging system, setting up the infrastructure, recruiting Whitaker, creating the conditions for their surveillance operation." She sent the information to Veronica's team, and we watched as my wife received the message, her expression changing subtly as she read the details about Chambers. She looked directly at the camera, knowing I was watching, and gave a small nod of gratitude before turning back to her team with renewed urgency. "The raid is being accelerated," Margaret explained, monitoring communications on a separate device. "With Chambers positively identified, we need to move before he can be warned about Whitaker's cooperation with authorities." For the next hour, we watched in tense silence as the operation unfolded. Margaret activated the audio feed, allowing us to hear the tactical communications between team members. Veronica's voice came through with remarkable clarity and calm as she directed analysts and coordinated with the field teams approaching the facility. "Team Alpha in position at the north entrance," reported a male voice. "Thermal imaging shows approximately 12 individuals inside the main floor area, with 2 more in what appears to be a secure room at the center of the building." "That will be the server farm," Veronica responded. "All teams maintain positions until we confirm the identity of those individuals. Chambers is our primary target. He must not be allowed to destroy evidence or activate any dead man's switches." I watched, heart pounding, as the raid coordinator counted down to simultaneous breach at 3 entry points. When he reached execute, The feed became a controlled chaos of movement and professional communication. Field agents reported their progress room by room, securing confused technicians who offered little resistance. Server room breached, came the report. 2 subjects attempting to delete data. One confirmed as Chambers, Robert. Second subject is... There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. Second subject identified as Special Agent Thomas Reeves, FBI Cyber Division. A shocked silence fell over the operations center. I saw Veronica's face pale as she exchanged glances with her colleagues. The betrayal of one of their own clearly hadn't been anticipated. "Secure them both," she ordered, her voice tight but controlled. "Separate holding areas. No communication between them. I want the cyber team on those servers immediately. Priority is stopping any data purge in progress." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of technical jargon and situational reports as the facility was secured and evidence preserved. I watched my wife coordinate multiple teams with impressive efficiency, never losing focus despite the shocking revelation of an FBI agent involved in the criminal enterprise. When the operation shifted to evidence collection and prisoner processing, Margaret muted the audio and turned to me. "This is a significant development," she said, her understatement almost humorous given the gravity of what we'd witnessed. "An inside man explains how they identified Veronica and knew so much about her investigation." "Is she in danger still?" I asked, the concern that had become my constant companion flaring anew. "Less than before," Margaret assured me. "With Chambers and Reeves in custody, the immediate threat is contained, but the network may have other operatives we haven't identified yet." She was interrupted by her phone vibrating with an incoming call. After a brief, tense conversation, she ended the call and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. That was the tactical team leader. During processing, Reeves mentioned a secondary operation already in progress. He's refusing to elaborate, but based on his smirk when mentioning it, the team leader thinks it might target someone connected to the investigation. My blood ran cold. "Maple Hills?" Margaret was already gathering her equipment, moving with controlled urgency. "We can't rule it out. I'm deploying additional protective details to key witnesses and team members' families." Before she could finish, my own phone rang, Mrs. Clark's number flashing on the screen. I answered immediately. "James?" Her voice came through, shaking with fear. "There are men in my house. They're asking about Veronica and the investigation. I've locked myself in the bathroom, but I don't think the door will hold. They're saying they'll hurt me if I don't tell them what I know." "Help is coming," I promised, relaying the situation to Margaret even as I spoke. "Stay on the line with me. Hide as best you can." Margaret was already organizing a response team, her voice sharp and precise as she directed agents to Mrs. Clark's address. "ETA 3 minutes, she told me. "Keep her calm." I talked to Mrs. Clark continuously, listening to her frightened breathing and the sounds of men searching her home, growing increasingly angry as they failed to find her. When the distinct sound of splintering wood came through the line, followed by her terrified gasp, I felt utterly helpless. "They're breaking down the door," she whispered. "Oh God, James, they're—" The line went dead. The next few minutes were among the longest of my life, waiting for news as Margaret monitored the response team's progress. When her phone finally rang, she answered it on speaker. "Hall," she said tersely. "Subjects neutralized, 2 in custody," came the report. "Mrs. Clark is injured but stable. Blunt force trauma to the head when they pulled her from the hiding place. Paramedics are transporting her to Denver Memorial now." Relief and rage warred within me. Mrs. Clark, kind, brave Mrs. Clark, who had stood with her walker before an SUV to protect my wife, had been attacked in her own home because of her loyalty to us. "I need to go to the hospital," I said, already reaching for my keys. Margaret nodded. "I'll have agents escort you. It's not safe for you to be alone right now." As we prepared to leave, a final update came through from the Nebraska operation. The data recovered from the servers had revealed the full scope of the operation, a sophisticated network that had infiltrated dozens of communities across 5 states, collecting personal and financial information on thousands of residents, with particular focus on government employees, law enforcement personnel, and those with access to sensitive infrastructure. More disturbing still was evidence suggesting the operation wasn't purely criminal in nature. Communications recovered during the raid indicated that at least some of the gathered intelligence had been packaged and sold to foreign entities interested in vulnerabilities within American government and security systems. "This is bigger than we thought," Margaret told me grimly as we drove toward the hospital. Chambers wasn't just running a sophisticated fraud scheme. He was facilitating what amounts to an intelligence-gathering operation against national security interests. The implications were staggering. Our quiet suburb, with its community garden competitions and heated debates about fence heights, had been ground zero for an operation with serious national security implications. And at the center of it all had been my wife, working diligently for years to unravel the network while maintaining her cover as nothing more extraordinary than a technology consultant who baked pies for her elderly neighbor. At the hospital, we found Mrs. Clark in the emergency department, a bandage wrapped around her head and a police officer stationed outside her room. Despite her ordeal, she brightened when she saw me. "James," she called, reaching out a trembling hand. "Did they get them? The men who broke in?" "They got them," I assured her, carefully taking her frail hand in mine. "They won't hurt anyone else." She nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "Good. I didn't tell them anything, not one thing. I remembered what Veronica said about not sharing information, even if it seems harmless." Margaret stepped forward, introducing herself officially. "Mrs. Clark, your bravery potentially saved lives tonight. Those men were part of a much larger operation that we've been working to dismantle." "I always knew there was something special about Veronica," Mrs. Clark said with surprising vigor despite her injuries. "A woman doesn't bake pies that good without having other talents too." The unexpected comment broke the tension, drawing a surprised laugh from both Margaret and me. Even in the aftermath of violence, Mrs. Clark's indomitable spirit remained intact. As doctors arrived to prepare Mrs. Clark for admission and observation overnight, Margaret received another call. Her expression darkened as she listened, and she stepped into the hallway to continue the conversation privately. When she returned, her professional composure had an additional layer of tension. "There's been a development," she said quietly. "Agent Reeves has started talking, trying to negotiate a deal. He's implicated someone else in the operation, someone with direct connections to Maple Hills." A chill ran through me. "Who?" Margaret hesitated, then met my eyes directly. "One of your colleagues at the high school, a history teacher named Sullivan. According to Reeves, he's been helping identify potential targets among government employees' children who attend the school." The name hit me like a physical blow. David Sullivan, my department head, my mentor when I'd first started teaching, the man who had attended our housewarming party and brought an expensive bottle of wine as a gift. The betrayal felt intensely personal in a way that even Whitaker's corruption hadn't. "Sullivan?" I echoed in disbelief. "Are you certain?" "We're verifying now," Margaret said, already typing instructions to field agents. "But Reeves provided details that make the accusation credible. If it's true, your school may have been part of their recruitment pipeline." The implications cascaded through my mind. Sullivan's access to student records, his position on the scholarship committee, his insistence on chaperoning college campus visits. Had he been identifying promising students with parents in sensitive positions, grooming them for future recruitment? "We need to move quickly." Margaret continued. "If Sullivan realizes the Nebraska operation has been compromised, he may attempt to destroy evidence or flee." As she coordinated with field teams to locate and apprehend Sullivan, I tried to process this latest shock. The web of deception and betrayal had spread further than any of us had imagined, ensnaring colleagues, neighbors, community leaders, people we had trusted implicitly with our security, our children, our daily lives. And at the center of it all, Veronica had been working silently for years, piecing together the network's operations while maintaining her cover, even from me. I found myself wondering what other secrets might still be hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly ordinary lives, and whether the foundations of trust in our community could ever truly be restored. Mrs. Clark's condition deteriorated rapidly during the night. What the emergency room doctors had initially diagnosed as a mild concussion revealed itself to be something far more serious. an intracerebral hemorrhage, likely caused when her attackers struck her, and her head hit the bathroom counter as she fell. By morning, she had been moved to the intensive care unit, unresponsive and connected to a ventilator, as neurosurgeons worked desperately to relieve the pressure on her brain. I maintained a vigil in the waiting room, joined by several neighbors who had heard about the attack. The Alvarez family brought food and fresh clothes for me, while Toby Mackenzie set up a virtual prayer circle on social media that quickly gathered hundreds of participants from across Maple Hills and beyond. The outpouring of support was a stark contrast to the division that had fractured our community in recent days. "I've known Eleanor Clark for 35 years, whispered Martha Rodriguez, who had lived in Maple Hills since its founding. She survived breast cancer twice, outlived 2 husbands, and volunteered at the Children's Hospital every Tuesday without fail. She doesn't deserve this. None of us deserved any of this." When the neurosurgeon finally emerged from the operating room, his expression told us everything before he spoke a word. The surgery had been unsuccessful. The damage was too extensive. Mrs. Clark remained on life support, but brain activity was minimal. Her only living relative, a nephew in Arizona, had been contacted and was making arrangements to travel to Denver. "She stood up to them," I said quietly to the gathered neighbors, my voice thick with grief and guilt. When those fake HOA officers tried to take Veronica, Mrs. Clark placed herself in front of their vehicle. She knew something was wrong before any of us did, and now this happens because she tried to help again. The tragedy of Mrs. Clark's situation rippled through Maple Hills like a shockwave, transforming community sentiment overnight. Neighbors who had been suspicious of Veronica or resentful of the investigation suddenly found themselves united in outrage over the attack on a beloved elderly resident. The abstract concerns about privacy and government overreach gave way to a concrete, visceral understanding of the real threat in our midst. Messages of support flooded in, not just for Mrs. Clark, but for our family as well. Even Barbara Zimmerman, who had been among the most vocal critics of Veronica's covert work, appeared at the hospital with a homemade lasagna and tears in her eyes. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I was so focused on hypothetical violations of privacy that I couldn't see the real danger." Eleanor saw it. She always could see what mattered most. As word of Mrs. Clark's condition spread, Veronica received permission to return briefly from Nebraska. She arrived at the hospital looking exhausted, her professional composure slipping to reveal the emotional toll of the past days. When she saw me in the waiting room, she crossed the space between us in quick strides and pulled me into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "This is my fault. I should have anticipated they might target witnesses." "It's not your fault," I insisted, though part of me had been thinking the same thing. "It's the people who did this to her, the people you're working to stop." We stood together at Mrs. Clark's bedside, the beeping of monitors and the mechanical whoosh of the ventilator providing a grim soundtrack to our grief. Veronica spoke softly to the unconscious woman, thanking her for her courage and promising that those responsible would face justice. Whether Mrs. Clark could hear us remained uncertain, but the doctors encouraged us to talk to her as if she could. Later that evening, as we sat in the hospital cafeteria picking at food neither of us wanted, Veronica shared a development that added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. "We've been interrogating Agent Reeves," she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and betrayal. "He finally explained how they identified me in the first place." She paused, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. It was Margaret. Margaret Hull. The revelation struck like a physical blow. Margaret, the senior agent who had coordinated Veronica's rescue, who had shown me the operation in Nebraska, who had responded immediately when Mrs. Clark was in danger. "That's not possible," I said, shaking my head in denial. "She's been leading the investigation. She's been protecting us." "It was a masterful cover," Veronica replied, her professional assessment at odds with the pain evident in her eyes. "She's been feeding information to Chambers for years, staying one step ahead by controlling what we knew and when we knew it. The raid in Nebraska was only successful because she couldn't stop it without revealing herself once Whitaker identified Chambers." But why would she risk coming to our house, showing me the operation? Control, Veronica said simply. By involving herself directly, she could monitor exactly what we learned. And she needed to identify anyone else who might know about Chambers. She took a shuddering breath. She's been using us, James, using me, for years. The betrayal cut deep on multiple levels. Margaret had been Veronica's mentor, the person who had guided her career and supposedly protected her cover. The violation of that trust was evident in my wife's expression. A mixture of professional fury and personal heartbreak that I'd never seen before. We've had her under surveillance since Reeves talked, Veronica continued. She doesn't know we suspect her yet. The arrest happens tonight. The news about Margaret's betrayal spread quickly through the investigating team, though it was kept from the public and most of Maple Hills. The impact on morale was devastating. If they couldn't trust a senior agent with decades of service, who could they trust? The investigation that had seemed so close to resolution now appeared compromised at its very foundation. When the FBI director himself flew in from Washington to personally oversee Margaret's arrest, the gravity of the situation became even clearer. This wasn't just a local corruption case that had expanded into a multi-state criminal enterprise. It was potentially one of the most significant security breaches in recent FBI history. For our community, the consequences were equally profound. As details emerged about the extent of surveillance within Maple Hills, cameras hidden in streetlights, monitoring devices placed in the community center, HOA meetings recorded and analyzed, residents who had once trusted each other implicitly now eyed neighbors with suspicion. Who else might be involved? Who else might have been reporting on their daily activities, their conversations, their private moments? The vibrant, connected neighborhood we had cherished had been fractured, perhaps beyond repair. Community events were canceled indefinitely. The shared spaces that had once been points of pride, the pool, the clubhouse, the garden, stood empty and neglected as residents retreated into private anxiety and distrust. By the time Mrs. Clark's nephew arrived from Arizona to make end-of-life decisions, Maple Hills existed as a geographic location, but no longer as a community in any meaningful sense. The trust that had been its foundation had crumbled, leaving isolation and suspicion in its place. Mrs. Clark, who had embodied the best of our neighborhood's spirit, would never see her beloved community heal from the wounds inflicted upon it. She passed away peacefully 3 days after the attack, surrounded by neighbors who had finally united in grief, but too late for her to witness the reconciliation she had always fostered. The day after Mrs. Clark's funeral, a somber affair attended by nearly the entire neighborhood, a startling development shattered the foundations of the investigation that had consumed our lives for weeks. I received an urgent call from Veronica just before noon, her voice tense but with an undercurrent of vindication that I hadn't heard since the ordeal began. James, they've discovered the real mastermind. It wasn't Chambers, he was just another pawn. They found evidence in the Nebraska facility pointing to the actual architect of the entire operation. She couldn't share the details over the phone, but asked me to meet her at the FBI field office downtown. The drive there felt interminable, my mind racing with questions. If not Chambers, then who? Margaret Hall's betrayal had seemed the final devastating revelation, but clearly there was more to uncover. At the secure conference room where Veronica waited, I found her reviewing documents with several senior agents. The atmosphere was charged with a strange mixture of triumph and dismay. When she saw me, she dismissed the others with a nod and closed the door. "It's Franklin Whitaker," she said without preamble. "He's been running everything from the beginning. Chambers, the fake HOA officers, even Margaret Hall's corruption. He orchestrated his own arrest to throw us off track while the operation continued." The revelation was so unexpected that I struggled to process it. "Whitaker? But he's been in custody. He was cooperating with the investigation. Under controlled conditions that he himself helped design," Veronica explained, spreading photographs across the table. They showed Whitaker in what appeared to be his jail cell, but with access to a hidden communication device cleverly disguised as part of the plumbing fixture. He's been directing the entire operation from inside federal custody, using a network of agents he'd placed years ago. His cooperation was feeding us just enough information to seem valuable, while misdirecting us from his deeper involvement. The evidence was irrefutable. Financial records recovered from the Nebraska facility revealed a complex structure of shell companies, all ultimately controlled by offshore accounts tied to Whitaker. Surveillance footage showed him meeting with Chambers and other key figures long before he became HOA president, suggesting he had been positioning Chambers as his public face while maintaining operational control from the shadows. Most damning were encrypted communications recovered from the hidden device in his cell, revealing how he had orchestrated the attack on Mrs. Clark and several other witnesses across multiple jurisdictions, all while appearing to assist the investigation. "It's unprecedented," Veronica admitted, the professional analyst in her momentarily overriding her personal disgust. He created a multi-layered organization with deliberate false hierarchies. Everyone believed they were reporting to the top when they communicated with Chambers or Margaret, but Whitaker was receiving everything and making the actual decisions. "But why?" I asked, struggling to understand the motivation behind such an elaborate scheme. "What could possibly be worth all this? Power and profit in equal measure," she replied. The surveillance operation in neighborhoods like ours was gathering blackmail material on government officials, law enforcement, military personnel, anyone with access to valuable information or influence. They've been selling both the financial data and the intelligence to multiple bidders, including corporate competitors and foreign entities. The revelation of Whitaker's true role transformed the investigation overnight. With his careful facade of cooperation now exposed, investigators re-examined everything he had told them, uncovering deliberate misdirections and half-truths designed to protect his network, while sacrificing expendable operatives like Chambers and the fake HOA officers. When confronted with the evidence, Whitaker's carefully maintained persona of the concerned community leader finally cracked. According to the agents who interviewed him after the discovery, he had actually laughed, before launching into a cold, calculating explanation of his enterprise that chilled even veteran investigators. "Democracy is inefficient," he had reportedly told them. "True power comes from information, knowing people's weaknesses, their secrets, their pressure points. I created a system that generated more actionable intelligence on American citizens than most government agencies, all hidden behind the benign facade of neighborhood associations. No one questions the HOA president who wants to install security cameras or collect detailed personal information. It's expected." The following day brought another shocking development when Bradley Wilson, one of the fake HOA officers who had attempted to kidnap Veronica, requested to speak with investigators. After learning the full scope of Whitaker's operation and the attack on Mrs. Clark, he had experienced what appeared to be a genuine crisis of conscience. "I never signed up for hurting old ladies or selling out the country," he told investigators, according to the transcript Veronica shared with me. "Whitaker recruited me after my construction business failed during the recession. I was about to lose my house, couldn't afford my daughter's insulin. He offered good money for what he called security consultancy work for homeowners associations." Bradley revealed that dozens of financially desperate individuals, like himself, had been recruited into various roles within the operation, some as fake officials, others as surveillance technicians or data processors. Most had been told they were working for a private security firm contracted by legitimate homeowners associations to enhance community safety. By the time I realized what we were really doing, that we were gathering information to exploit people, not protect them, I was already compromised, Bradley had explained. Whitaker had evidence of everything I'd done. He made it clear that if I tried to leave, I'd go to prison, and my family would be left with nothing. His testimony provided crucial information about the network's structure and operations, including the locations of 3 previously unknown data processing facilities in other states. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed to recommend leniency, not immunity, but consideration of his circumstances and subsequent assistance. When Veronica brought me to meet with Bradley at the secure facility where he was being held, I was struck by how ordinary he appeared. a middle-aged man with calloused hands and worried eyes, so different from the threatening figure who had tried to abduct my wife just weeks earlier. "I'm sorry," he said simply, meeting my gaze directly, "for what we did to your wife, to your neighbor, to your community." I told myself I was just following orders, that I didn't have a choice, but that's not true. We always have choices, even when they're all bad. His evident remorse didn't erase his actions, but it complexified the narrative I had constructed about the people involved in the conspiracy. Like the neighbors who had turned against each other in fear and suspicion, Bradley had been manipulated by Whitaker's machinations. Not innocent, certainly, but also not the unmitigated villain I had imagined. As the full scope of Whitaker's operation came to light, Veronica faced a difficult decision. Her expertise in financial tracking and the knowledge she had gained throughout the investigation made her the ideal candidate to lead a new task force focused on dismantling similar operations nationwide. The promotion would recognize her exceptional work and utilize her unique skill set, but it would also mean transferring to Washington, away from our home, our community, and the life we had built together. "This case has shown how vulnerable communities like ours can be," she explained as we discussed the opportunity late one night in our kitchen. Homeowners associations manage over 74 million households in America, with virtually no federal oversight. They're perfect covers for surveillance and data gathering. Someone needs to address this vulnerability before another Whitaker exploits it. The passion in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just another assignment, but a mission she felt personally called to undertake. Yet I could also see her internal conflict, the way her eyes lingered on our home, on the photographs of us with neighbors at community events, on the simple life we had shared before everything unraveled. "We need to rebuild here first," I said, taking her hand across the table. "Maple Hills is shattered. Mrs. Clark is gone. Our neighbors don't trust each other, or us. If you leave now to fight this battle nationally, what happens to our own community? Who helps them heal?" My words gave her pause. I could see the weight of competing responsibilities settling on her shoulders, duty to her profession and country, balanced against commitment to the immediate community that had suffered so much collateral damage from her work. "Maybe there's a third option," she said slowly, an idea visibly forming. "What if I could do both?" The trial of Franklin Whitaker became one of the most significant federal cases in recent Colorado history. Over 3 weeks of testimony, prosecutors meticulously documented his elaborate scheme, revealing how he had systematically infiltrated dozens of homeowners associations across 5 states to create a vast intelligence-gathering network. The evidence presented painted a disturbing picture of how ordinary community structures could be weaponized against the very residents they were meant to serve. When the verdict came, guilty on all 37 counts, including conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and accessory to assault resulting in death, a collective sense of justice rippled through Maple Hills. Many residents attended the sentencing hearing, where Whitaker received 85 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The judge, in her powerful sentencing statement, emphasized the profound violation of community trust that made his crimes particularly egregious. "You exploited the fundamental structures that bind neighborhoods together," she told him, transforming tools of community governance into weapons of surveillance and intimidation. "In doing so, you didn't just defraud individuals, you poisoned the well of civic trust upon which our society depends." The other conspirators received sentences proportionate to their involvement and subsequent cooperation. Robert Chambers was sentenced to 25 years. Margaret Hall, whose betrayal had struck so deeply at the heart of federal law enforcement, received 30 years, despite her eventual cooperation after her arrest. Sullivan, my former colleague, accepted a plea agreement in exchange for providing information about the student recruitment operation, receiving 15 years. For Bradley Wilson, his substantial cooperation and evident remorse resulted in a reduced sentence of 8 years, with provisions for his family's needs, including medical coverage for his daughter's condition. Though justice demanded consequences for his actions, the case had taught me that, even within such a conspiracy, The lines between perpetrator and victim could blur under the weight of personal circumstances and manipulation. The reforms that followed the case were sweeping and substantive. New federal regulations were established for homeowners associations, including transparency requirements, limitations on data collection, and prohibitions against certain surveillance practices. An oversight board was created to monitor compliance and investigate complaints, giving homeowners a recourse beyond civil courts when associations overstepped their authority. But legal justice and regulatory reform, necessary as they were, couldn't heal the deep wounds in our community. The trust that had been violated between neighbors, colleagues, friends wouldn't be restored through courtroom verdicts or policy changes. That healing would require a different kind of work, one that began with Veronica's unexpected decision about her career. Rather than accepting the Washington task force position, Veronica proposed an alternative approach, establishing a pilot community resilience program in Maple Hills that could serve as a model for vulnerable communities nationwide. The FBI, recognizing both the practical value and the public relations opportunity, approved her proposal. She would remain with the Bureau, but focus on rebuilding the communities she had helped protect, developing strategies that could be implemented elsewhere. The program began with a simple premise: transparency. In a community meeting held in the high school gymnasium 6 weeks after Whitaker's sentencing, Veronica stood before our neighbors, not as an undercover agent, but as her authentic self, both FBI financial crime specialist and longtime resident. "I've lived among you for 8 years, she told the packed room, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "During that time, I've been part of your lives, and you've been part of mine. The secrets I kept were professional requirements, not personal choices. But now we have an opportunity to rebuild something stronger than what was broken, a community based on genuine trust and mutual protection." The program she outlined combined security education with community building initiatives. Workshops taught residents how to recognize legitimate versus suspicious HOA activities, protect their personal information, and report concerns through appropriate channels. A volunteer security committee was established, with transparent oversight and strict limitations on authority. But perhaps most powerful were the community healing events: block parties, garden replantings, renovation projects for elderly residents. We began with Mrs. Clark's house, which had stood empty since her death. With her nephew's blessing, we transformed it into a community center named in her honor, with meeting spaces, a small library, and a garden that became the heart of the neighborhood's renewal. As summer turned to fall, then winter to spring, the program began showing measurable results. Participation in community events increased month by month. Neighbors who had become virtual strangers during the crisis found themselves working side by side, rebuilding not just physical spaces, but the invisible bonds of trust that truly make a community. 1 year after the fake HOA officers had appeared at our door, Maple Hills gathered for the dedication of a memorial bench for Mrs. Clark in the community garden she had loved so dearly. As I watched the diverse crowd, the Alvarez family chatting with the Richardsons, Toby McKenzie showing Mrs. Rodriguez how to use the new Community Alert app on her phone, Barbara Zimmerman arranging flowers alongside Veronica, I realized we had created something remarkable from the ashes of betrayal. "She would have loved this," I said to Veronica as we stood slightly apart from the gathering, her hand warm in mine despite the autumn chill. "Not the memorial itself, but seeing everyone together again." "I know," she agreed, her professional reserve softening as she surveyed what her work had helped create. "This is what security really means. Not cameras and regulations, but people who look out for each other, who know and care about their neighbors." The FBI's Community Resilience Program, born in Maple Hills, would eventually expand to dozens of communities across the country, becoming a model for healing after similar breaches of trust. Veronica would split her time between our home and other locations, training local agents and community leaders in the approaches we had pioneered. Her dual identity, now fully integrated rather than compartmentalized, became her greatest strength, allowing her to bridge the worlds of federal law enforcement and local community activism. As for me, I returned to teaching history, though with a newfound focus on civic engagement and community governance. My students, initially fascinated by the sensational aspects of what had happened in Maple Hills, gradually came to understand the deeper lessons about democracy, trust, and the vigilance required to maintain both. Our story became less about dramatic raids and shocking betrayals, and more about the quiet, determined work of rebuilding what had been broken. Each reopened community space, each revived tradition, each new connection between previously suspicious neighbors, represented a small victory over those who had sought to exploit our trust for their own gain. In the end, that was our most meaningful form of justice. Not Whitaker's lengthy prison sentence, but the flourishing community that rose from his failed attempt to destroy it. Maple Hills had been tested, wounded, and nearly broken apart, but had emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more genuinely connected than before. The scars remained, but they had healed into something stronger than what had been there before. In the twilight of our years, we seek the comfort of community, those familiar faces and shared spaces that remind us we're not alone in this world. The story of Maple Hills reminds us that true security isn't found in cameras or rules, but in neighbors who notice when your curtains remain drawn too long, who bring soup when you're ill, who stand with you when danger comes knocking. Like Mrs. Clark, we all have the power to be the heart of our neighborhoods, to choose courage over comfort when facing those who would divide us. Though trust can be fragile, especially when broken, the work of rebuilding it is sacred. It's the small acts that matter most, the block parties, the community gardens, the patient conversations across differences. The greatest legacy we can leave isn't in our possessions, but in the communities we help nurture and protect. In a world that grows increasingly isolated, let us be the generation that remembers the value of a neighbor's watchful eye, a community's collective wisdom, and the strength found in gathering around a shared table. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.